Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry to break into your lunches so early, but it's actually not early anymore. So we are going to start off with the program here. I'm Shyam Das. I am here to introduce our president, Kathleen Miller. And before I talk about her, I'd just like to introduce the family members at our table. Our daughter, Samantha, her husband, Tobbs, and their three musketeers, Aiden, Theo, and Corinne, and Alex and Bree, our daughter, and Alex, her husband, and their two children, Willa and Desi, who is the youngest of all. Our two other children, Sarah and Jason, couldn't be here, but they send their love and congratulations. So I do have a few pictures I'm going to show here, assuming I can figure out how to do it. I looked at this picture and it immediately said to me, "Counsel, my watch tells me it's 10 o'clock. Are we ready to begin the hearing?" As you can see, Kathy exhibited her professional skills at an early age. I would like to focus today a little bit on Kathy as a person, what got her where she is, because I believe that has much to do with her strength and breadth and the breadth of her professional success as an arbitrator and mediator that has culminated in her presidency of our academy. Kathy was raised largely by her grandparents, who she adored. They instilled in her a deep sense of empathy, respect for others, whatever their position or circumstances, love of learning and nature, and the importance of how you live your life, not just your accomplishments. Speaking of empathy, as some of you who know her may have observed, Kathy has the uncanny ability to start talking to someone, even a complete stranger, and soon have them telling her the story of their lives and asking her advice. While she was growing up, there was an early labor connection. Kathy's grandfather, who was a very young man, had arrived alone at Ellis Island from Poland, was president of his local union, and her grandmother kept the locals' books, and Kathy was often the go-between. From an early age, it was clear Kathy had grit, determination, and a don't mess with me attitude. Recently, in the context of the Me Too movement, she shared a story which I hope she won't mind me sharing with you. It was triggered by a news media column some of you may have seen, entitled, quote, another quote, "I bet he likes you," close quote, is the wrong thing to say. Like many, Kathy wrote, and these are her own words, "Like many women, I have a specific memory," she names a boy, "in elementary school. He followed me everywhere including at recess and to and from school, often pushing me, hitting me with things, teasing me relentlessly. When I finally got so sick of it that I complained to my teacher, a nun no less, you guessed it, quote, "I think he likes you." He kept it up until finally one day I'd had enough. I reared back and punched him right in the face, knocking him off his bike. His mother went to the nuns and complained that it had been, quote, humiliating for her son to be punched and knocked down like that by a girl. The upshot, the nuns tried to make me apologize to him, and I refused. So they made me stay in for recess for a week as punishment. Kathy also could and can charm the socks off of you. Kathy grew up in Wheeling, which is in the panhandle of West Virginia, sandwiched between Ohio and Pennsylvania. It was then a prosperous, lively, and lovely city. I think it's safe to say that when Kathy graduated from Wheeling Central Catholic High School, some of the nuns were relieved she was moving on. Dogma does not sit easily with Kathy, and she has always wanted to know why and why not. There were some others who saw her potential and the richness of her character and provided encouragement. What Kathy will readily admit is that the nuns taught her good grammar and the proper use of the English language. There she is graduating. I always cringe in anticipation when I ask her to read something I have written. You can imagine how difficult the age of Trump is for her on this score alone. Let me also mention that while in school, Kathy was recruited to join a local swim club and became a champion diver and backstroker. Kathy matriculated at Bradley College in Illinois. Those were momentous times. In the summer of '68, she and her friends were in Grant Park during the Democratic Convention when Mayor Daley unleashed his forces. Kathy finished college at the University of West Virginia. If you're observant, you will notice the change in her hair length since high school. Kathy then went on to graduate school and began to teach English at the University of Pittsburgh. Among her students was Pitt's outstanding running back and later Pro Football Hall of Famer, Tony Dorsett. A longtime friend shared the following memory with me. When Kathy was in graduate school, she came over to Millville, New Jersey, not far from the Jersey Shore, to work in a glass factory. She was sorting glass bottles as they came down the production line and packing them in boxes. This is very hot, tiring work with temperatures rising to over 100 degrees. She did it because it was union wages and she needed the money for tuition. But when I mentioned to her that my young daughter had told me she wanted to learn how to surf when she was older, but she knew only boys could surf, Kathy said something to the effect, "Surf's up," and off we went to buy surfboards, used. We never became very good surfers, starting with the fact that we'd had our surfboards backwards at first. But Kathy became known as Moondoggie in certain circles. And this friend's daughter did learn to surf when she became a teenager. Kathy will tell you that her most significant and rewarding role has been as a mother. After her two daughters, Sam and Bree, started school, Kathy decided to go to law school. Her first day coincided with Bree's first day in first grade. Here she is on graduation day with a couple of other, quote, non-traditional students. The choice of statuary in the background does not seem coincidental. Unlike many of us, Kathy knew early on that she wanted to be a labor arbitrator. She had become familiar with arbitration before law school, and she turned down a prestigious judicial clerkship when Sylvester Garrett, one of the giants of our profession, asked her to come work with him. Thus began a very successful career as a stellar arbitrator and mediator of both labor and employment disputes. Kathy has a deep love for this academy and has served it in many capacities, culminating in her presidency. I should note that this has been a particularly challenging year, what with the cancellation at the last minute of our 2017 Fall Education Conference in Miami because of Hurricane Irma, and the untimely death this past winter of our President-elect David Peterson, to name just two unexpected events. As usual, Kathy rose to the challenge with great aplomb, and I will admit to being biased, has performed magnificently. Family, as I noted, is the center of Kathy's life. Here she is with Samantha and Bree. Oops. Not sure how that got in here. Did I mention Kathy loves dogs? Here are some happy family gatherings. Kathy loves to travel. Here she is with some newfound friends in India and in Istanbul. The young girls in India flocked to her, and it only became clear why after a while when they all asked for Bic. They all wanted Bic pens from and thought she was a likely source. She has great stories to tell about these and other places she has been. Just ask her. And for those of you still insisting there was no collusion, here's all the evidence Special Prosecutor Mueller needs. With that, I give you President Kathleen Miller, a rebel with a cause.
Thank you so much, Sham. Sham is an extremely loving and supporting life partner, but he's also a very gentle soul. And I never knew until this moment that he was capable of having vengeance in his heart for my introduction of him 3 years ago. The year of my presidential term has been wonderful and rewarding, although, as Sham noted, very challenging, including with events within the Academy. Earlier this year, George Nicolau called me one night to check in to see how's everything going. He already knew the litany of events, but after I had given him quite an earful, I'm afraid at length, at one point, George said, well, what about your presidential address. How will you ever find time to write one? After I said to him, I have absolutely no idea, he said, I think my presidential address was good. Why don't you give it again? And he said, no one will know. I have no doubt that George expected that, as usual, I would appreciate his impish wit. But I don't think he fully appreciated that it was a dark and stormy night. So as soon as we hung up, I went into my office and with pounding heart pulled down the appropriate volume from the proceedings. But as soon as I started to read George's address, my hopes were dashed. In his very first sentence, he started talking about the remarkable fact that the Academy was turning 50. Now, I knew everyone would remember our black tie gala when we celebrated our 50th anniversary in Chicago in 1997. I ended up reading George's entire address, as well as a sampling of other presidential addresses, which is an exercise I heartily recommend. Early in George's address, he described in detail the first two meetings in the fall of 1947 and January of 1948 of what would become the National Academy of Arbitrators. George aptly described those early gatherings as the Academy's glorious beginnings. And he named many of the arbitrators who were in the room where it happened, including Ben Aaron, it's a long list, but Ben Aaron, Gene McKelvey, Willard Wirtz, George Taylor, Teddy Keel. If you read the full list of arbitrators he names, you will recognize some who in their later years were openly revered as the giants of our profession. But the observation George made that most struck me was he pointed out that when our founding arbitrators began to meet in 1947, they were all relatively young then and did not consider themselves giants at all. Well, they weren't yet. They obviously developed into giants through determination and hard work, but also by virtue of their vision and the sheer confidence with which they pursued some very ambitious goals. What also struck me as I thought about it, though, is that our early leaders also, who were creating our gold standard, were essentially making it up as they went along. When they wrote our Constitution and bylaws, when they wrote the Code of Ethics and Procedural Standards that precluded or preceded our current code, they started out with a blank piece of paper. And I never have supposed that the wisdom in those governing documents was self-evident at the time. It certainly wasn't self-actualizing. And I like to think of them as gathering all the knowledge they could cobble together from all sources, from the earliest arbitration boards, going back to the War Labor Board and earlier, from their own experience, taking a deep breath and taking their best shot. I find it particularly useful to view the early giants of the Academy in realistic human terms, because that serves to remind me that a subsequent course through both smooth and troubled waters has been charted by members with very similar qualities: determination, ambition, confidence, and of course, vision, regardless of whether they also eventually were lionized publicly. Another thing that struck me, I must say, as I read through a sampling of presidential addresses, is how often our early leaders predicted what they often referred to as the conclusion of the golden age of arbitration, and how often they lamented that. It would be presumptuous, if not déclassé also, of me to engage in one-upsmanship with our early leaders, but I firmly believe that at this very moment, in 2018, both labor arbitration and the Academy are facing a confluence of adverse circumstances, the collective likes we have not seen since 1947. These include circumstances we have addressed for years, but also some prodigious legal, political, and even cultural challenges that are testing our mettle in the United States, and I believe even sending an ill wind blowing from the south that may have an impact here in glorious Canada. Over the last year, I have discussed the current status of labor arbitration and the future direction of the Academy with many members who occupy every point along the spectrum, from optimism to the darkest pessimism. Every one of them is dedicated to labor arbitration and the Academy. And for that reason, hearing the assessment of the most pessimistic among them has been very poignant, a poignant experience for me. I heard some mournful longings for the golden days of arbitration that reminded me of a striking line from William Butler Yeats' poem. And Sean, I didn't know you were going to out my college teaching of English background, or I may not have included this. But it did remind me of a line from Yeats from a poem, Sailing to Byzantium, which addresses the agony of trying to maintain vitality in old age. In the poem, as an old man watches young lovers frolicking along a lakeside, he describes his heart as sick with desire and fastened to a dying animal. Oh. That was almost the viewpoint of some of the members I was talking to. I don't think we should be flirting with despair yet. But I do think our current legal, political, and social circumstances are sufficiently extreme and chaotic that the immediate future will require each of us to dig as deeply as we ever have to find and maintain the inspiration we will need to fashion creative solutions during the next period when I believe conditions are likely to get worse before they get better. That term, inspiration, sounds so exalted as to be maybe a bit pretentious. But I'm reminded of, another line by Yeats, from the circus animal's desertion. This time, the poet desperately was seeking new inspiration at a time when the creativity that had fueled him for so long seemed to be hopelessly elusive. Eventually, he was buoyed by the epiphany that the early sources of his inspiration were not actually as exalted as that term implies. Rather, they were the debris which appeared to be mundane and useless until he fashioned them into something exalted. This was an inventory he described as old kettles, old bottles, and a broken can, old iron, old bones, old rags. In the end, Yeats described his intended path to renewed inspiration in this way. Now that my ladder's gone, I must lie down where all the ladders start, in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart. I invite each of you, along with me, to grab your ladder while the ladder's good, and plant it as firmly as possible in creative territory as I summarize briefly this moment in 2018, at least as I see it. There are many legal challenges, including the rapid pace at which the recently reconstituted NLRB and FLRA are establishing new standards, some of which overrule precedent that has stood for many years. More importantly, we all are eagerly awaiting the decision of the Supreme Court in the Janus case. This is the same court that issued the Epic Systems decision just on Monday. These decisions constitute judicial establishment of federal labor policy, as did the Steelworkers Trilogy in the 1960s. And the universal prognostication is that Janus, in particular, will deliver a powerful blow to public sector collective bargaining, including labor arbitration. Regarding the backdrop of related legislation, on the eve of the Janus case, there are 25 states with so-called right-to-work statutes. The 2 states that most recently became right-to-work had a strong prior legacy of supporting collective bargaining: Michigan in 2012 and Wisconsin in 2015. Since then, a steady stream of additional legislation has been passed, or at least attempted, that circumscribes collective bargaining rights. Legislation allegedly reflects the will of the people, and a substantial segment of the current pundit class often observes that the populace today sees far less value in collective action in the workplace than it did in the last half of the 20th century. If that is so, however, what can we make of the events of the last few months, which National Education Association President Lily Askelson Garcia has labeled the education spring? A statewide teacher strike in West Virginia was followed by similar statewide action, collective action by teachers in Oklahoma, Kentucky, Arizona, Colorado, and North Carolina, all red states. Only the strike in Colorado was legal, and public sector employees in West Virginia have no collective bargaining rights at all. We are politically divided, and I believe quite apparently confused at this moment in 2018. In my view, dramatic negative changes in our broader social culture present us labor arbitrators with an even more immediate challenge, because the workplace is a microcosm of the broader culture. As events unfold and developments gain prominence in the broader culture, a multitude of associated issues inevitably trickle down into our hearing rooms. For a period of years not long ago, the number of cases involving drugs, harassment, and violence proliferated rapidly as a result of high-profile related events in the culture at large. Parties struggled to develop responsive policies and programs, often ultimately agreeing to disagree. So we, in turn, struggled to fashion standards that would accord with the developing judicial law, and in time, would establish the relevant law of the shop. Similarly, we have applied every iteration of evolving drug standards under the influence, impairment, system presence, and we also have addressed the "I was only joking" defense numerous times on our way to establishing in other cases the objective standards as applied from the vantage point of the person on the receiving end of a racist, sexist, or threatening comment. And how many zero-tolerance policies have we interpreted and applied on the way to establishing that the just cause analysis will survive unless and until the parties remove the just cause standard from their contracts? Then more recently, along came social media, a virtual explosion into every nook and cranny of our culture, including the workplace. Thus far, it has been nearly impossible for judicial law and the law of the shop to keep pace with the ramifications related to both off-duty and on-duty conduct, especially given the brand new facts and issues that spring from such rapidly advancing technology. The only constant in those cases is the backdrop of old-fashioned human complexity. Most striking to me, though, are very recent cultural transformations that are so dramatic to have landed me in the unprecedented position of feeling like a stranger in a strange land. Traditionally respected behaviors like restraint and civility have been vilified through their rebranding as political correctness or elitism. Despite substantial resistance, this transformation has served to unleash a range of behaviors which for many years have been confined primarily to the shadows. Beyond merely boorish behavior, emboldened voices increasingly are filling the public square with racist, misogynistic, homophobic, Islamophobic, and xenophobic speech. Even more noteworthy in my book is the fundamental transformation in the way a substantial segment of our culture now processes information. Critical thinking seems to have gone missing, and with it, sound judgment. Creeping anti-intellectualism has served to turn many of our traditional norms on their heads. Respect for knowledge, articulate expression, and thoughtfulness has been sacrificed to unabashed fervor for telling it like it is, regardless of what it is. Disregard for facts has morphed into disdain for facts, and now here we sit, facing somewhat widespread denial that facts even exist. I have tried to imagine a long-term healthy future for our culture in the absence of common acknowledgement of the inherent differences between fact, opinion, and emotion, and that is beyond me. It is for all these reasons that, with all due respect to the Academy's historical leaders, I am convinced that our members face unprecedented challenges in 2018. I have no definitive answer to these challenges, but I do have some thoughts that will form the foundation of my own game plan. To a large extent, all the participants in labor arbitration, the parties, the advocates, and we arbitrators, will be passive vessels as we await legal and political events we have no ability to control. But I believe that although our profession likely will contract for the foreseeable future, labor arbitration will survive. And as long as it does, we labor arbitrators, as always, actually will have an inordinate degree of control with, that's okay, honey. I love you. An inordinate degree of control with respect to our ability to shape and preserve the unique and historically effective process of labor arbitration. One thing I know down to the bottom of my heart is that I never will lose sight of how privileged I am to spend my life doing such meaningful work. I remember a moment from years ago when I heard a case in Wyoming that required a site visit to the company's soda ash mine. I, along with an entourage of party representatives and attorneys, excuse me, descended the 1 mile down to the operational floor of the mine in an open wire elevator they called the cage, after which we traveled to various areas of the mine in a Jeep. The modern sections of the mine included enormous, sophisticated pieces of multi-million-dollar equipment. But in what they called the traditional mining areas, being in those made me feel like we had taken a time machine back to the early 20th century. I expected at any moment to see someone set down a stack of dynamite, run around the corner, crouch, and cover his ears. At one point, I noticed a patch of the ground that seemed to be undulating slightly. When I asked what it was and was told it was a pocket of methane gas, I couldn't help remarking, "And I went to law school for this?" They laughed, of course, but they couldn't possibly have appreciated how far removed my joke was from my actual sense of privilege at being able to devote my life to a profession that is so challenging and, and intellectually stimulating, but that also permits me to dig in up to my elbows, sometimes even literally getting my hands dirty, as I learn about the operational realities of manufacturing, service-related injuries, government agencies, municipalities, all manner of workplaces where individuals in both management and labor live out their ordinary lives. It has been even more rewarding to know that parties repeatedly have trusted me to construe and apply the collective bargaining agreements that regulate their complex relationships in these workplaces. At this historical moment, I also feel more obligated than ever to exercise my jurisdiction in ways that maintain not only the distinction between labor arbitration and litigation, but also all other kinds of arbitration that are ubiquitous in contemporary media. I regret that the general public identifies as arbitration the forum where a party to this dispute involving Stormy Daniels was able to go and obtain an ex parte, no notice, temporary restraining order. And I understand why such widespread disdain for arbitration results. But I'm also gratified to know that it is largely within my control to ensure that any individual who is involved in a case I hear and decide will go away with respect for arbitration, for our arbitration, even if he or she is not aware of the nuances encompassed in the formal definition that aptly describes why our forum is unique. And that is arbitration. Every word is meaningful. Arbitration that is agreed to on a voluntary, pre-dispute basis that resolves disputes about parties' rights and responsibilities under a collective bargaining agreement which governs an ongoing relationship that will survive the resolution of any particular dispute. I have no delusion that we labor arbitrators single-handedly can compensate for the absence of political leadership, or worse, that has contributed to the creeping anti-intellectualism and other cultural degradation that I addressed earlier. But in our small but meaningful corner of the world, we certainly can effectuate our established principles, including due process, civility, and not just respect for, but commitment to the ultimate importance of facts. One obvious example is the Me Too movement, which comes straight out of the workplace and inevitably will surface in our hearing rooms soon. Competing forces already have developed within this movement. On the one hand, our culture seems suddenly to have discovered some underlying fundamentals that, in my view, have been percolating in full view since the 1980s. And that is that behavior that constitutes sexual harassment or assault is an expression of power rather than sexual attraction, and that delayed reporting often is attributable to the involved power imbalance. On the other hand, due process obviously is sacrificed if every accusation automatically is accepted as being truthful. I think the broader culture will be struggling with the raw emotions associated with these competing forces for a long time. But I don't believe that compromises our ability, when we hear such cases, to make an important contribution by simply doing what we always do: identify the facts, follow the facts, and apply the well-established principles of due process without exception. It may sound simplistic to state it that way, but my real point is deeper. At a time when emotion is overwhelming fact-based substantive discourse, when nearly all our institutions are under attack and losing credibility, I think it is within our control to ensure that labor arbitration serves as one port in the storm. In fact, the only port for parties in the represented workforce who find themselves in the position of needing access to workplace justice. Finally, I think it's important going forward to exercise as fulsomely as ever the broad authority granted to us by the Supreme Court based on our expertise in the law of the shop. In my view, this includes recognizing when approach which may not be useful or even acceptable in litigation produces constructive results in labor arbitration. Despite valid criticisms of creeping legalization and arbitration, I do think we have cases which by their nature require a more structured legal approach. For example, cases involving complex successorship and other significant legal issues, cases requiring substantial statutory construction or application of judicial law. But I, for one, will continue to use a more informal approach in cases where relaxed rules will benefit not only the individuals involved, but also the parties' ongoing relationship without compromising the integrity of the process. For example, I think there is legitimate room in some cases, especially certain ones involving an individual grievance, for what often is called therapeutic testimony. This is testimony that everyone in the room who knows anything about the rules of evidence knows is completely irrelevant, but nonetheless serves the valuable purpose of allowing someone whose interest is at stake to feel like he or she has been heard. He or she has had his day in court, regardless of the outcome of the case. One of my most extreme experiences with therapeutic testimony also reminds me of how many advocates I've worked with who understand the broad meaning of the definition of labor arbitration I read to you earlier. This was a case involving an unusually long suspension, and the parties asked me to hear it on an expedited basis so they could get a quick resolution. Near the end of the hearing, the union introduced as its final witness the grievance wife. This drew no objection, so I swore her in, wondering privately if she possibly could have firsthand knowledge about some matter and issue. But no, during her brief testimony, she straightforwardly asked me to return her husband to work as soon as possible because she said he was driving her crazy at home. Really? And she took just a minute or two to detail some of his more irritating habits. Of course, I had no way of knowing whose idea it was to put her on the stand, so I contented myself with recalling the advice of Sylvester Garrett, my long-ago mentor, who had told me many times that at times when the parties choose not to make me privy to the reason for an unopposed, unusual, but essentially benign occurrence, I should just simply assume that it contributed to the good of the order. In closing, I just want to say, it truly has been my honor to serve as the president of the Academy, and the highest privilege has been the opportunity to work closely with so many Academy members, from our impressive new members to the giants among us, some of them right here in this room. I best can sum up my thoughts about those experiences by calling one last time on a line written by my buddy William Butler Yeats in the Municipal Gallery Revisited. I have taken the liberty of adding 2 words to his line, and you easily will identify them. Think of where man's and woman's glory most begins and ends, and say, my glory was I had such friends. Thank you.